Thank you, Stuart.
Cool. All right. So, confession quickly, I've not rehearsed this at all, so this could be very quick or it could be very long, but it almost really won't take the full hour that I've been given. So, the idea behind this talk was to take a step back. I think I've been to a lot of really great talks about things that we can do around putting specific tools in our pipelines, things we can do earlier on in the process, and all of that adds a huge amount of value. But I think from my observation, either directly or indirectly through people I know that have shared war stories, it feels to me that there's some foundational things that we can get right before we start looking at tools. I really picked up on something Michael and Kaveh were saying with their experience in their talk earlier, is they're not in an environment where they have a full control of the infrastructure end to end. They have to request that from another department. They have not the full cycle of DevOps that you might require to be able to adopt some of these practices that we talk about day in and day out. But I think hopefully what we talk about today will hit home for everyone, and there's something you can take home. I don't have all the answers. I'm hoping you guys have more answers that I can steal. So if you have great ideas of how we can solve some of these problems, then please come and chat to me, or if you can relate to it in some way, that'd be good to know that I'm not the only person that's seen this sorts of stuff. So I've said there for some definition of real, because the real world's different for everyone. It's very easy to say, oh, but in reality this is how things work, but in reality that's not, because my environment's going to be different to your environment. And if you work in one company for a very long time, then you get used to that way of working. If you move from one company to the next all the time, then you've got this constant shift in the working practice of that organization. So we're all coming from this from a different perspective. But I think the root cause of the problems are much the same. So the other thing is I need to give away a couple of books. So I thought to make sure that people are awake, not necessarily listening, that's up to you if you want to listen, but every now and then I'll chuck out a book. I've got 2 to give away, so keep an eye out and we'll deal with that as it arises. So yeah, this talk is not about shifting left. This is not about tools. It's not about a particular product or the build pipeline. I'm looking at this more of the bigger picture of what are we doing, why are we doing it, how do we communicate that, how do we share information, and how does this fit into some overarching bigger picture within the companies that we work in. And at the write-up I think Michael wrote, which he actually I think wrote for me in the meetup synopsis, because I wasn't quick enough to give him a synopsis, was talking about anti-patterns. So I've picked 2 examples of things that I've seen or verified that other people have seen at least as well, and we'll go through those in a bit of detail. The first one's a bit longer than the second, and then at the end I'll just talk about some of the stuff that we've done internally at Equal Experts around how we want to address some of these problems across the board, and it would be good to get some feedback or ideas from people afterwards if they want to. So, talking about requirements, there are 3 kinds of anti-patterns I've noticed with security requirements in different projects, and these vary from one team to the next or from one organization to the next, but they seem to come up quite often. So I don't know if this is something you guys have experienced as well, but anyway, here we go. So the first one I'll talk about is effectively what I would call something like pick and mix, where you get, if you're working on a team, you get a set of requirements handed to you which aren't really requirements. It's more like a shopping list of someone's favorite security products. And there's no direct link between those products and any particular problem that they're trying to solve. And I think what worries me about this sort of scenario is, aside from the frequency that it comes up with, it takes the conversation away from what a requirement really is, and it becomes imposing a solution on a team. So I've been in situations before where many months go on where you're having this conversation about why we should be using product X. I'm trying to keep this as product generic as possible because the products themselves aren't good or bad, it's the way that they're used, I think that is really important. And so let's say, for example, you were told you have to use this particular WAF for your project, but there was no explanation of why, there was no detail of what the problem is that you were trying to solve with that product. You just have this ongoing debate of what are we trying to solve? No, you just need to use this product. What are we trying to solve? And it kind of goes round and round in circles for ages. And eventually you get to the situation where Some teams, for example, I've seen adopt the product that they're told to use, don't actually route any traffic through it, or don't really use it, but they can say that they've used the thing that they were told to use. Tick, done. We've installed your shiny box. We're happy. Security's happy. We can carry on. No issues. I think it starts out well intentioned. I genuinely do believe people have the best motivation most of the time, and I think what happens somewhere along the line is particularly as engineers, we like to say, well, this worked really well in this project, therefore it'll work again really well in that project. But sometimes we forget to draw the dots between this project isn't actually exactly the same as that one. We're not trying to solve the same problems, and we're not working with the same team in the same environment. So we've got to some extent, take a step back and say, from foundations, is this actually the right thing to do still in this scenario? So we have this well-intentioned view that eventually becomes not about risk anymore, not about business value, but this is the way it's always been done. We've always used product X in this scenario, so we're going to use it again here. So the other element of this is, where you get requirements handed over to a team where the requirements is being given by a group that aren't actually familiar with how that product works. They don't have hands-on experience installing it, maintaining it, operating it, and they also aren't going to be the ones to do that anyway. They're giving this requirement to a team that says you have to use this particular product, and that team may not have the skills to do so. And I think, do we really want to be getting a team to use something that's fundamental to the security of our product when they don't have any knowledge of how that's working? It feels like we're setting ourselves up for failure, and we're creating an environment where that team is more likely to create a security risk than solve one, because we're giving them something that they're not skilled in or experienced in. So the kind of problems here is we're not talking about risk really, and we've shifted the conversation in the wrong direction. The next anti-pattern around requirements is kind of related, but it's not so much about the shopping list, it's about the approach to saying we want to just tick things off our list. And here again, this is, aside from the I want, this is verbatim from a user story I've seen on a project. And the worry that I've got with this sort of approach is this justification is so that we're covered. If I was a product owner and I was reading this and I was trying to prioritize all the features in my backlog, I'd be looking at this saying, I don't see business value here. I don't see why I should do this over the 20 other things on my backlog. So that's just going to slip down the list. And you could substitute the whatever that I want for anything that comes to mind. So in this case, it's I want to use parameterized queries. It's a very technical explanation of what we're trying to do. There's a very big disconnect between how this ties up to me as a product owner saying, I'm building X, and it should be delivering this value to my customers. Who wants this? Who's actually asking for this? Because this feels like an internal customer asking for something that we don't really need. So that's a bit of a gap. In fact, just the other day, I was talking to a couple of people working on a project somewhere that they discovered that they had the security architecture team, and one of the architects had taken a cryptography standard. So this is going to get rolled across the whole organization. It's a very large company as well, and rather than doing proper vetting on the sources of information, they hadn't actually written the standard themselves. They'd copied a standard from another company, but that other company had their standard written by an accountant, and it was about 5 to 10 years out of date and not quite accurate. So we've got this problem where we're trying to enforce compliance with standards. We don't necessarily have the quality standard that is what we want the company to be using anyway, but we're driving it in a way that people feel very separated from, or they don't really buy into what we're actually trying to do. So we've not sold why we're doing this. We're there to tick a box. It's not just compliance. So it's common in compliance type scenarios, but I don't want to give the impression that that's around regulation. It's not just about PCI or anything like that. Internal compliance can be just as much of a pain in these sorts of scenarios as external. So even just having some very policy-oriented company where you've got a set of rules and everyone must use these rules, you've got the same problem there. It's about saying, why are we doing this? Does this policy actually match what we're trying to deliver? And if it doesn't, then we should have some flexibility there to examine alternatives and get back to the basics of the risk we're trying to address rather than the specific steps we're trying to do. And then the third one, which is also fairly common, is requirements by pen test. So in this situation, you have a delivery team that's building a product. They build for weeks, potentially months. Then at the end, we have an external company come in. They run a pen test for a few days on that particular product. They produce a report, and your security requirements are effectively anything that's high risk in that report. And then you can go back and you can build those. Other than that, the team has no real concept of a security requirement. Nothing's come into them in any way. There's no policy, there's no standards. Even if they were weak, they're not really there. There's no engagement with the security team. Everything's either mediated between an architect or a product owner or a business analyst, and the team doesn't have any direct conversation with people that can say, how are we building this product? What are we trying to solve? Where are the risks? So Chris's talk earlier about threat modeling, having that session early on, that just isn't happening in a lot of cases, and so people don't really have the sense of, why should I care about this security stuff early on? I'm getting my requirements at the end. The other issue that I find with this particular situation is you place a lot of emphasis on the opinion of someone who isn't involved in delivery, but you're not valuing the opinion of the people who are involved in delivery, and they're the ones that have the greatest context on what's being built. So I've seen a number of cases where an external pen test company comes in, they're not even given direct access to the delivery team. So their remit and their scoping is based on a definition made by a different part of the organization. And sometimes there's a disconnect there as well, where the pen test comes out, like one I saw not so long ago, that a team was building a mobile app and a back-end API that app was consuming. The area of greatest risk as far as the team was concerned was the back-end API rather than the mobile app. But that didn't feature at all in the pen test. The pen test was very heavily focused on the mobile app because whoever had scoped that believed that that's where the area of risk was. And it almost doesn't matter who's right. The problem there is this communication gap between the people building the thing and the people setting up the requirements around pen testing. There's no communication, and so we've got these gaps, and there's just no way you're ever going to succeed in that sort of environment. But especially, it's just too late. And I said the talk's not about shifting left, but this point kind of is. It's too late in the process to be finding out what you should have been doing 6 months ago.
That's a good question on that one. Do you think it's like the lack of communication or the fact that you're maybe not aware of it? They just don't know there's a security component they should be aware of?
Possibly a bit of both, but then I think that still boils down to communication. If someone doesn't know a part of your organization exists, that sounds like a communication problem, because they're either not being vocal enough about their presence, they're not seeking out projects. And that's easy to say sometimes, it's very hard to do. I've been in situations where you just don't know a new project started up. If no one tells you that something's kicked off, then you're not a miracle worker. But there's often some organization or some part of the organization that's responsible for kicking off projects and trying to find out who they are, so you can get early insight into like there's often like a project management organization or program delivery or various different names. If you can find those people and say, hey, give us a heads up when you hear a new project kicking off, that's a good tee up to go and speak to that team and just say, hey, this is who we are, this is what we do, we'd like to get involved. Can we have a chat when you guys are doing your sprint planning or doing your early inception or whatever it is that your ceremonies are for your organization?
And do you see this as a vicious circle that ends up creating those regulations, just so you end up looking for those people, but instead of looking for those, you're looking at regulation to have to deploy a WAF?
It does. It can easily degenerate that. In fact, there's a quote later on from Mikhail Zalewski from Google, and he talks about sometimes focusing too much on the policies. The policies are written with good intentions. You end up focusing too much on the policies and rather than explaining to someone why they should do it, and it ends up creating this real bad cycle where the policies are well intentioned and they make sense, but they've got no context and they're not sold in the right language to the people that are building them. And so you end up as a security team losing your view of, well, why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? We certainly weren't created to write documents. That's not what we're about.
Thank you.
Yep. So looking at how we can rethink security requirements, just 3 things came to mind. So scenarios, actually I'll work through this backwards. The language matters. I'm picking on this one because I've already said it a few times. If we're not speaking in a language that someone who is going to be prioritizing this work understands, it's not going to happen. I get really frustrated when I hear the talk about, oh, developers should just write more secure code. That's not the problem. That may be part of the problem. That is not the source of the problem. Developers do not decide which features go in a backlog. At least very, very rarely do they decide. Someone like a product owner or an external stakeholder, however your organization does it, I don't know, but it's almost certainly not someone going to the developer saying, hey, what do you think should go in the backlog? Yes, let's do that. There are a lot of people involved in that, and if they're going to pick up a feature, they're going to want to know why they're delivering that feature. So speaking the language of business value in terms that they understand is really important. It's almost like the same as saying tech debt stories. So many times you have these conversations about piling tech debt. It's like, well, yeah, because you're calling it tech debt. No one's going to prioritize something if you're calling it tech debt because they can't relate to that. They don't see that as what is the value to me as a business stakeholder in building that. How do I understand that that's not just people wanting to be perfectionist about their code? And that's not what it is, but it's just not communicated in that way. So it's very hard to expect someone to act on it.
What do you suggest calling it instead?
I think if we can't articulate a value like, okay, this particular thing that we need to do is going to make this other feature go faster, or this is going to enable us to take this other thing forward that you want to build. If we can't do that, then I'd question whether there is business value.
But as a product owner, I can see the product owner going, oh, that sounds like tech debt, I'll put that label on it.
Well, I didn't say it was going to be an easy conversation.
Okay.
And it almost certainly always is going to be hard when you're doing something that you can't necessarily directly tie to a feature that an end user is going to directly interact with. But I almost guarantee that if you call it tech debt, then it's going to go nowhere. Or it's going to be very difficult for it to go somewhere. Unless you have a very, very astute, very technically minded leader or product owner that understands how you work. Again, coming back to the whole real world security thing, there are places where that happens, and that is amazing. But I don't think it's the majority of organizations. Or it's certainly not the majority of teams. There may be pockets in organizations that do things really, really well, but particularly in larger ones, those pockets are scattered around a much larger system. So yeah, so language is important. Involving the whole team, I kind of preaching to the converted on this. If we're building a system and we're getting this system pen tested or threat modeled or whatever, if we're doing that in an isolated group, it's almost like the ivory towers that Aubrey was talking about that people hate, where someone comes and says, you must do this, and then they shut the doors and they don't listen to you. It's not good for a relationship between those two parts of the organization. It's not really a team. It's two different parts that are fighting against each other, and there's a lot of friction there. But if you can involve the team in the threat modeling, and you involve the team in scoping pen tests and talking to the pen testers and walking through their areas of concern, they'll often reveal a lot more insight very quickly that will save you a huge amount of time if you have to go and trawl through that yourself. And then the last one is around using scenarios. So there's a talk by, what's his name? I know his handle, Ryan McGeehan. So he's an ex-Facebook guy, and he makes this, what's the link? He's got a blog post called Decomposing Security into Risk Scenarios. A really, really good read. I've got the link if anyone wants it, I can share it. I thought it was on the slide, but it's in my notes. And he talks about these requirements should be based around scenarios, and the scenario should be based on risk. So he picks out something like from PCI, where there's a requirement that you have antivirus. But antivirus is a solution, not a requirement. What's the risk? What's the risk you're trying to address? Shouldn't the risk be the requirements? And antivirus is one of the solutions to that requirement, but there may be other solutions. And I think if we take the same approach, this is often where the policies kind of go down the wrong path, is they tend to become very prescriptive things of you must use this product, you must do it in this way, you must always do static analysis, you must, all these different activities, and we just create a greater burden on teams, but the risk measurement isn't really there, or the link to risk isn't really there. So this is the quote from Mikhail Zalewski. That link is at the bottom if you want to read the article. So it's all about, the blog post is titled Getting Product Security Engineering Right. But the thing he talks just before this about, instead of giving someone an answer about why they should be doing something, we direct them to page 17 of such and such a policy that says they must use a WAF, and then there's another policy that says they must run a fuzzer for so many CPU hours, and we're kind of missing the point. And instead, his point is, rather than doing that, what is your mission statement? What is your reason for existence? How do you want this to change the way the organization's working? What does success look like? And I think that's a really key thing, and I think there's a lot of value that we can have if we come up with a really good view of what we are, because then also we can explain that to other teams who maybe don't relate to security very well. And to pick up on a specific example, so this is from performance rather than security. About 2012 or so, I used to work at Betfair just as this was kicking off. And one thing I really liked was we had this very, very clear mission that the whole company was behind. Our objective was around optimizing performance of our site because it was horribly bad. And as you can see, 18 seconds at the 95th percentile for page loads, which is ridiculous. And the benchmark for every single feature people built was you cannot break that. You cannot get any further away from that than where we currently are. You can only get closer. So if we start with 18 seconds and you release a new change, it has to be faster than 18 seconds until we reach that full page load in 3 seconds, full content, or useful content in 1.5.
After or before analytics?
Including everything.
Like
I tried to break this down into more coherent sections. So I've done a bit of a key of how I think this works. And the 4 key things here for me are, where are we? So in the blue, we know exactly where we are today. So where is the situation that we're working from? What does success look like? How will we know when we get there? And how are we measuring it in red? So there's no ambiguity. It's not like your performance goal of, it must be fast. Fast for who? Under what conditions? There's very clear metrics there, very clear way of measuring it. And lastly, how are we going to demonstrate progress? How are we going to be transparent about this so people can hold us accountable to it as well? And people can all get behind it and buy into that. And some stuff went really well. We did actually achieve that. It was hard work, but the fact that there was a coherent message that everyone could get behind that was very specific, there's no hiding behind cracks and saying, but in this case we can do this. That was the unbreakable rule, and it worked really well. So a challenge I'm giving myself is to do something like that for security.
When you say the 95th percentile, is that 95% of the time?
95% of requests will achieve, 95% of page requests will achieve that. Yeah. So even things like typical user bandwidth, we expanded. What does typical user bandwidth mean? And we used, our own metrics as well as a bunch of external resources to measure typical user bandwidth. So we'd look at, what are our users actually on? Because it's pointless doing this if you're testing from AWS, where your bandwidth is ridiculous. So what does a DSL user on a 2 meg line experience? That's typical user bandwidth, for example, or whatever is relevant in your scenario.
Free
Yeah, if you're on mobile devices,
mobile
you're
devices.
not even that lucky. Yeah.
So I just got a quick comment. So
Yeah.
the challenge I find within cybersecurity is that, so in performance, you do have standard set of attributes that
Yeah.
you can work with. In security, we don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
As you just said, you can
That's why I didn't have a proposal.
And I think that's the challenge that we all face. What do we measure?
Yeah.
And how do we measure it?
Yeah.
And how do we see that measurement changes over time with our success?
Yeah.
How can we simulate reducing performance? 19 seconds down. What are we trying to reduce in security or increasing security?
I heard a really good podcast. I can't for the life of me remember the guy's name. He's one of the authors behind Agile Application Security, John someone or other. I'll look it up afterwards if you want. But he talks about measuring security, and I think Zane Lackey does as well. And it's about shifting the measurement, so it's not like this, but it's about how have we made things better. So how have we enabled teams to release faster? So Chris mentioned this about in the threat modeling. How do we demonstrate that we've allowed teams to release or have a security review done in 1 week instead of 6 weeks? That's a metric we can measure. It may not necessarily be about doing things like blocking X number of attacks, because maybe you just don't even know about some of them. So how can you possibly quantify that? But quantify the things you've done to enable teams and to speed them up maybe is a good starting point. But
Measuring risk is a solved problem, though. We're not. This is just because we're cybersecurity doesn't mean we can't
Yeah.
learn from other industries.
Yeah.
Insurance do it really well. If
Yeah.
they did it really well, they wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
So measuring and articulating risk
Mm.
is a solved problem.
Yeah.
That problem we've got is that we deal with shit like critical, high, medium, and low,
Yeah.
which is meaningless. You need to convert it to something which is quantifiable.
Yeah.
Once you've got it quantifiable, you can add, you can take, you can divide, you can treat it like numbers.
Yeah. And I think
But it's really hard.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if anyone's got a solution to this, please. Sorry.
Especially because it's a moving target all the time.
Yeah.
The paradigm changes all the time, the market changes, the code we do changes all the time, and the attackers changes all the time.
Yeah.
While insurance, most of the time, it's like nature or someone that tries to attack you or steal something.
Insurance is also a much older industry, so they've had a lot longer to refine this. I'm sure they made more mistakes in their early days as well. But
Yeah, they learn
But,
from
but
that.
if we don't
but
start,
it's-
then we'll never get there.
exactly, yeah,
I think one thing you mind about insurance is that they tolerate some risks, right? They accept some risk willingly because they know we'll pay it out. Question is,
We don't want to
can
pay
you
it all.
quantify that risk for yourself to figure out if you can pay it out?
But if you go speak to your execs and
Yeah,
say,
they know that.
"Look, we can get this down to a 10% chance of £1 million loss per year, do you want to get us to zero? That's going to cost you 100 million for us to do that.
Yeah.
Is your
It's a number of
it's a similar
Yeah.
conversation to the uptime stats.
Yeah.
So yes, you want
Disaster
99.99,
recovery.
it's going to cost you X.
Yeah.
You want an extra 9, it's going to cost you X
Yeah.
to the power of
How much is your available?
yeah.
And then
Yeah.
How much is this cost to be down? 1 hour, 1 minute, 1 day? If you're set that as a cost, I know how much I can spend.
Yeah. For me, having something like this, I think I would find very valuable, even if I just start with one metric that I think is easy to measure today, because I've got something to work towards, provided everyone agrees it's a sensible measure.
Which is?
Well, that's what I need to figure out. I don't know. Well, it's going to vary from one place to the next, right? Because your starting position is different. What you're measuring for success today in an organization is
In terms
very
of
mature.
security.
Is going to possibly be quite different to someone who's just starting out. Sorry, you want to say?
You could go even further and say that because of the questionnaire we asked customers who left us, we understand that when customers back to peak times during a half time in a game, any kind of delay in time will result in them going to a competitor. Do you think you could go even further and give the kind of business rationale to this specific measurable target?
In this case, yeah, but I think the challenge is trying to equate that. So how do you know customers have left you because of a security incident, except that you've got to wait for it to happen? Like all the customers that left TalkTalk, would they have been able to quantify? Maybe they would, and they just didn't, or they did and they were willing to take that risk. I don't know.
But you'd have to use that industry type benchmark on the experience from other
Yeah.
industries or similar industries.
And I think that's where we often fall down, is we've got no shortage of news stories with enough information that we can use those as tabletop scenarios to run through and say, how would we fare in this scenario? Are we happy with where we are today? And I don't think enough of us
Most people aren't even able
are doing
to
that.
retrospect and analyze that until it
Yeah.
actually happens.
Yeah,
Oh, we're kind of secure. We know there's risks, but how much of that is a risk? If someone penetrates your system, how much data will they take out of that?
yeah,
And until something like that happens,
yeah,
and you know that it happened, which those are two very different things,
yeah,
you're unable to quantify that.
yeah.
I think one of the problems with this is that if you do have a security breach or something does happen, I don't think you know what the impact of that is until a very long time. If you take the example of TalkTalk and other companies like BA, they took credit card details, they took the information. And nobody knows what the impact of taking that is.
Yeah.
Because after it's exposed, it's a very dark kind of circle after that. It could be weeks, months, it could be years before the actual cost effect of that, isn't it?
Yeah, the total cost, yes. I think the cost direct to BA in that case might be more quantifiable, because the long-term impact, I think, is more to the cardholders themselves rather than to BA directly. But
But
yeah,
there is a fine, isn't there? I think that they are subject to a financial penalty for that loss.
yeah,
I'll look it up.
But then they'll also have penalty projects internally, and whatever regulator they are will come in and audit them, and
Yeah.
those costs will build up
Yeah.
as well.
So they
So you-
need to
you-
apply code changes, they need to inspect those code changes, they need to make sure the functionality is there. Someone at some point is going to be another gate control that says we can no longer host code that's not inside our network.
yeah,
So these things build up in terms of costs in mid to long term.
yeah.
But you don't need to know these things in order to be able to quantify that risk. if you try to, it's the same as you said before. To add the extra 9 of confidence.
Yes.
It costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
So just deal with like 80% confidence. Like, we've seen this happen with BA. We've seen this happen with TalkTalk. So it'll probably happen to us.
Oh yeah, but any
If
of us in
we
this
were
room knows
breached.
perfectly whatever company we're working, we are at certain level of risk.
So
That's much higher than most people actually expect it to be. That's
when you're quantifying your secondary costs, you just take examples and say, in the
So-
same scenario, this would probably be
So
the secondary.
should the referential always be money in terms of security? Is this what we're trying to achieve as a benchmark? Is how much it costs, or is the security something else?
The
other than
cost could be very subjective as well, right?
Well, I mean, this is, I take on board what you said there, Justin, but BA faces possible £500 million fine for breaches. That's easily quantifiable, isn't it? And in similar situations, or dissimilar situations, it's going to be a hefty sum of money. So that's potentially going to set where, you've set your risk scales, and if you're happy with 80, but then you go back and say, well, look, actually the fines are going up now. You might actually want to, reduce your
Adjust your risk tolerance. Yeah.
in line with those figures. I mean, maybe
Let's
that's
get
a bit high.
another 9 there because the cost is so high.
Cool. For the sake of moving on, because that conversation could easily go on for days, who wants a book?
Last person to speak.
Who's got the most colourful socks on? I need to think of something creative to give away.
Oh, black socks, no good.
Anyone not wearing black socks?
I'm wearing 2 socks.
They don't deserve the book. Who is disqualified?
So I've got colourful.
Oh!
Too late.
You can have the next one. Right. Everyone is awake. Cool. So, moving on from requirements. Visibility. So,
One question on
yeah.
that fair example. Did they actually get it down to 1.5 or 3 seconds?
Yeah.
Is it maintained?
No. No, actually, I don't know. I'm not sure.
It's easy.
I was there for about 2 years. I don't know what happened since.
Someone
Just
from
load the
marketing
page
came in and
twice.
asked for another pointer.
Just on your phone, load the page twice and time it.
There's actually, if you do a search for Tim Morrow, Tim Morrow Velocity, he was my boss there. He does some really good talks on the stuff we did at Betfair at the Velocity conference, the one that Michael's got a ticket for, if you wanted to find out more and see what happened there. So yeah, visibility. This is a much quicker one, don't worry. So the other thing I've noticed is we often don't have a very good view of what we're actually running. And I guess this has 2 elements to it. One is, depending on the size organization you are, it can be quite difficult to have a single view of everything across the organization. But even sometimes within subsets, like programs or divisions or departments or however your organization is structured, even those subsets don't really have a good view of what they're running and who they can go and talk to if they have a problem, and how X might impact Y if there was a problem. And coming back to the whole real world angle again, I think sometimes the conference speaker circuit can be heavily skewed towards people who are doing cutting edge, and that's great because it gives us all something to work towards, but I think there is still quite a lot of people who aren't in that position yet, and there's a lot that they could benefit from doing things where maybe it's not as simple as just saying, okay, well, we stick this in a pipeline, because they haven't got a pipeline yet. So I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe a lot of companies don't yet have DevOps and Sec joined up. There are still big gaps between some of those areas. Again, I've worked in large organizations where this is really slick within a division or within a delivery group, but outside that, it's just like the world hasn't changed since 1960. And so, solving this on an organizational scale isn't necessarily easy. You also have a scale problem, so you might have a centralized ops team, centralized security team, and then tens of development teams, and the bottleneck eventually comes to a point where the ops and the sec people just cannot cope with everything, so they have to just ignore vast swaths of whatever is going out there and only just fight fires. So we've got some real issues there. The other one is around projects, not products. I don't know if you've come across the term. There's some really good blog articles, I think, from ThoughtWorks on it. But the distinction being projects start and end. So you'd stand up a team to build something, the thing would be built, the team would be disbanded and move on to something else. Whereas a product is something that lives until it's gone, and that team is created to build the product, own the product, support the product through its life cycle, and then decommission it when it dies. But it's a long-lived thing with continuity, as opposed to these bursts of activity where something is just handed over to someone else to look after. And that's often where things like live services teams with BAU or maintenance teams come into play, and you've got one team supporting 600 applications, none of which they built. They have no idea how they work or what they do or the criticality of them, and they're basically told, do not touch this thing unless the world is falling apart. And that I don't think is very uncommon. And also we talk quite a lot about running in AWS and Azure, and that's all great, but a lot of people aren't there yet. And the kind of tools at your disposal can be vastly different between running in a data center and running in a cloud. Even your mindset around how you solve problems can be quite different when you're having to deal with a lot more manual work. Even automated cloud infrastructure is not necessarily as powerful as, even automated data centers aren't as powerful as a lot of cloud providers can be. So keeping in that context, it's very hard having a single view of how things are running when you're having to struggle with these other problems as well. But the reason why I think this is important is if we look at the thing we're building and we get that really secure, that only matters if the rest of it around it also has a similar level of attention. So if you've got, let's say you've got a microservices platform, or you've got even not even microservices, just a set of websites that all interact with each other in some way, and the security of one depends on the security of another. Maybe they share a domain, they share some information back and forth, and the team that are building the one are really, really good, and the team that are building the other are not really good. There's a link and a dependency there where the security of one depends on the other. But if you don't have that joined up view of how each service is being maintained, you may forget that link exists, and you may lose focus on how you can actually make sure that you're not protecting the app, you're protecting the organization and the data within it and the customers of the organization. So securing one app isn't enough if 40 other apps are insecure and more likely to be exploited. So this isn't a hypothetical, this is something we actually did at one of our clients, which was really, really cool. It's probably grown since I moved on from there, but the idea was to try and solve this whole visibility problem. Again, I'll put this in context, this was not solving the problem for the whole organization, it was just far too big, but within our delivery area, this is one of the things we built. We built this thing called the catalog that sits in the middle, and this is a microservices platform, about 800 microservices running, about 50, 60 odd teams spread across the country in different delivery centers and so on. And what we were trying to do is make it really visible. We had a few, I guess you could call them like enabler teams, platform teams that would build core infrastructure, common platform services that other teams could build upon. And then we had loads of other teams that would build applications that were more end user facing and leverage some of these shared components. And one of the central teams built this catalog that sits in the middle and pulled information from a whole variety of sources and surfaced it in one view where you could go and find out whatever you needed to know. So if you needed to talk to a team building another service, you could go there, you could look up by service, by Git repository, by individual, by team, whatever. You could find who is responsible for building a service, who is on that team, and in what role. So who's the product owner, who's the delivery lead, who are the devs, who's the tech lead, whatever. You could find out the Slack channels that team operated in. We had a convention for Slack channels as well, so some were used for notifications, some were used for just general internal team discussion, and others were used for public team discussion where you could talk to another team where you were maybe a dependency of them. So you could find out how to get hold of them on Slack, click a link, you're in their Slack channel. Hooked into user management, obviously, to find out who owns what. All the user management was tied up between GitHub, our own internal LDAP system, and various other bits and bobs. We had a leak detection service that ran on all our Git repos. So on a regular basis, every commit would scan to check if you had leaked any sensitive information in Git commits. And if there were, it would flag them up again in the catalog. You could view everything that you need to address within your service, just highlight the line of code, what you have to do, and then rerun it. At the bottom we have dependencies, so it would pick up what dependencies each service has and show you a view of that and which ones are out of date. which ones are almost out of date, primarily around internal shared dependencies that we control, so not necessarily the open source security vulnerabilities. Hooked into Jenkins, so you could go to the build jobs for that team or for any service, any set of tests, you could have a look at where it is. Releases, so you knew which version was deployed in which environment when. You could track the history and see who deployed it if you want to go talk to them. And then some internal metrics that we were measuring on things like how often is the team creating a tag, how long does it take that tag to get into production, what is their ratio of hotfixes to proper releases.
What was the overhead of creating and maintaining that catalog?
Sorry?
What was the overhead of creating and maintaining that? Because this is a flux, changes a lot. New products are added, products are discontinued, teams change a lot.
So most of this, the overhead was fairly low in maintaining it because everything was pulled from external systems. So teams changed, that's reflected in GitHub and user management, just pulls in the latest information. The APIs aren't changing, the data within them is changing. There was a team that looked after that among many other things. So there was again, products, not projects. That was a product that was owned by an internal team. And the reason I put it into context is this is not something you can necessarily justify on a very small scale. But when you've got 50 teams and 800 services, the cost of building this is vastly smaller than the benefit it brings.
Yeah, true.
And this did help us on a number of occasions when we did have issues we had to investigate. And you have to say, well, where have we got this vulnerability? It's in these repos. You've then got APIs. You can script everything to find out which repos are affected, who to speak to, create a list of people to talk to, and you've basically automated your fact-finding exercise as well.
Also, was it also time-based? So if you go back and release, you know what team was back then working on maintaining this?
No. No history.
Was real-time?
It was real-time based on today. Yeah. So some of the back-end systems, like the release management system, I think you could go back and see which releases were done when, but they wouldn't tell you who the team was back then. But to be honest, that didn't really matter because that person doesn't own it. The person who owns it today is the person that matters.
And what did you use for the release? Did you use a database, or what did you do?
I don't know. I didn't build that aspect. It was it was part of our in-house release management system. So a lot of the stuff was built around the same sort of time that a lot of the more microservices-oriented platforms were coming out. So we ended up building our own sort of Frankenstein Kubernetes that is being migrated now away from onto Kubernetes. So a lot of the stuff that we're trying to use, we ended up building ourselves, which for better for worse. So I don't know the specifics. I think that was probably just data that was pulled out of the release management stuck in Mongo. Probably nothing fancy.
In terms of workload, how long was a project or a product like this taken to be built?
Probably, all told, it was ongoing for a couple of years or so. I mean, didn't take that long to build, but there's always little things that come in. So it starts small. That thing didn't start with everything. It started with GitHub and Slack and user management because that was sort of the core essentials. And then we have the view of, okay, we've got all these different environments. Let's just link to the Jenkins jobs. Cool, we'll bring that in. And as feature requirements come in, the leak detection was one of the newer things. The indicators, the tape measure thing, the indicators had been around a long time and they just needed a place to be surfaced up, whereas previously that information was visible only to the team that actually measured those metrics. But now we could surface it up and say, hey, we've got a way to identify when a team's struggling and they can't really keep up, they're trying to move faster than they're actually capable of moving. So they're doing more tags, they're taking longer to release to production, and they're not actually solving problems, they're having more hot fixes. But it's food for thought. The number of times I wanted to take this thing and open source it and say, look, this is a solution, but it just doesn't really feel like it's tied in so closely to all these particular tools that it's a very difficult problem to generalize in a way that doesn't become just configuration nightmare. But as an approach, it's helped us massively.
Most of companies or a large chunk of new startups will use some of the same
setups. At least some of them, yeah.
Like GitHub will get, or GitLab, or
yeah.
you have Slack or something else, and you have Jenkins or CI, and all of them are the same thing.
Yeah. In fact, that catalog project is an open source project, so you can have a look at it. It's not open source in the sense that it's designed for other people to use, but it's open source in that it's a public Git repo if you want to have a look at it. So if you're interested, come chat to me. I'll show you the link to it. Okay, let's have another. Well, we are running out of time, so I'll wrap up very quickly. But another book. I promised one to the man with the very fancy socks. I'll give you a choice. So we've got security DevOps, practical monitoring, and incident response.
Your personal best.
And work
Your life manager.
So we don't have no time on it. I could have 2 years worth.
So I'll wrap up really quickly. This is more just to give an idea of a draft of something that we've been working on internally at EE. So a while back in June we had an internal summit with the security practice. So it was just a few of us, and we got together and we talked about how do we see security working for us as a company. So this is very much a thing that we've aimed at ourselves, but something we want to open source, not so that other people necessarily adopt it verbatim, but it's often useful to see how other people have done things, and you can say, oh, that looks good, or that looks bad, we don't really want to do that. Something you can learn from and come up with your own approach for doing it yourself. So we've started working on something we're calling our secure delivery playbook, and the idea behind this was every organization works in a different way and has a different culture and different approach to things. Our culture is very much one of autonomy and trust, and so we work with people where we give them the ability and empower them to do whatever they feel is most important. We give them the assistance that they might need to see that through, but we trust that they're going to make the right decisions and they're going to do the right thing for our clients. So we're a consultancy. We don't build stuff for ourselves. We build stuff for other people. So we've always got to keep in mind, like, are we actually doing the right thing for our clients, while at the same time staying true to our ethos. So what we did is we looked at a whole bunch of really, really valuable resources that are out there, and we saw first of all, there's a lot of overlap between various things. So if you look at SAM, you look at BSIM, for example, there are massive similarities between them. They have different objectives and they have different sort of line items, but the high-level structures are very similar. BSIM is more about, well, what do people actually do, whereas SAM is maybe more about saying, this is what you should do. Core Infrastructure Initiative, I think, is one of the most understated, the Best Practices Badge is one of the most understated projects there is. If you haven't heard of it, come talk to me afterwards, I'll give you a link, or just search Linux Foundation Core Infrastructure Initiative, you'll find it. It's basically a set of requirements specifically aimed at open source projects, but requirements that you have to achieve to reach certain levels of like bronze, silver, gold, or whatever, as a hallmark of you're a good open source project. And it goes from the very basic of, you've got to read me, and it goes to far more advanced scenarios as well. You've got specific, whatever they've deemed appropriate, specifically aiming at open source communities. So they've also got requirements for, like, you've got a contributors file, so people can see how to contribute to your project. You've got a public website. Now, not all of that's directly relevant to us, but there's a lot of real gold in there that we want to adopt. They've got a section specifically on security. Have a look at that. But anyway, there's all these different bits, and we wanted to bring them all together, because what's not helpful is when you go to a team and say, oh, here's like 15 references you can go look at. Each of them are an 80-page file. No one's going to look at that. They're not going to look at the first one. So we wanted to distill all that down. It's something that says, well, look, we've done the hard work of thinking how this applies to us in our environment, and we think this is really helpful. Here's a set of practices you can follow. You choose which ones are most relevant to you, which ones are most beneficial to you, and how to adopt them. We'll give you help if you need it, but here's your starting point, and it's a much smaller resource. So we've kind of broken it down to these 3 sections. Participants we thought was a really valuable aspect to bring from BSIM, so they highlight who are the different people or parties involved in delivering secure software, and I think that's really valuable. Also highlighting, well, what is their role? So we talk about security champions like everyone knows what they are, but a lot of people may not have heard the term before. So just giving a short summary of this is what a security champion is, and there Mozilla's got a really good 3 bullet points. A security champion does these 3 things. Job done. So just pulling out other references can be really valuable. We've got a set of principles. So we've broken it down into the principles and practices. Principles apply all the time, non-negotiable. Security is always a collaborative effort. It doesn't matter what project you're working on. It is always a collaborative effort if it's going to be successful. It is continuous. It's not something you do at the end or the beginning or the middle. You do it all the time. And it's contextual. You cannot create a prescriptive set of security requirements for one project and then lift it and shift it onto another one, because it just doesn't work. You're not building the same thing. So you've got to have some room to apply the context of the problem you're trying to solve. But then the practices are contextual. So the way you actually deliver on those principles will vary from one project to the next. So we've broken it down into 3 sections of organize, build, and operate. So organize is like the foundational stuff that you need at an organizational level more often than not, or at least at a broader level, so it's not per team. Things like vulnerability management, incident response, you're not going to have every team come up with their own plan for that sort of stuff, mostly because they're not equipped to do it, but there's no ways that's going to get their attention when their focus is delivering a particular project or deliver a product. So a lot of that sort of stuff becomes an underpinning that everything else relies on to be successful. But then build and operate are seen as the two ends of continuous delivery. So we're constantly building stuff and operating it, and it's a feedback loop between the two. So build, how do we actually ensure what we're building is secure, and broken it down into some sections. We've got specific practices under all of them. And then how do we securely operate something as well? So it's not just about doing static analysis or dependency checking when you're building and then ignoring the thing in production. So even things like the phrase is security in the pipeline, security of the pipeline. So it's all very well having all these tests, but if your pipeline is running on Jenkins and EC2 open to the world, well, really? Then you're kind of getting some fundamentals wrong there. So that's the quick preview of what we're working on. I hope to open source it. That is the plan. I'll follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn or something if you want to see when it comes out. But that's it. I hope it's given some food for thought. If nothing else, just said, okay, well, we're not the only ones in this sort of situation. If you've got ideas of how we can solve some of these things, obviously we had a good chat about the measuring risk and all that, but if you've got ideas, let me know. I'd love to steal them. Cool. Thank you very much.